Hey everyone, so I want to talk this time about the Four Noble Truths in Buddhism, which remember are the truths that the Buddha essentially saw in his enlightenment. He sort of had noticed them before, which we talked about in the story of the Buddha, like dukkha, impermanence. He had vestiges, sort of intuitions about these things. And after he became enlightened at the age of 36 and became a teacher, he would be preaching these for the rest of his life. And it wasn't until a few centuries later that people wrote down what is the Pali Canon, where a lot of this comes from, where we have his wisdom actually written down. But like many wisdom traditions, it started as an oral tradition. But the teaching is divided. It typically starts in these Four Noble Truths. Before I get into them, which I already touched on a little bit in the last one, I just want to talk about some general ideas. So, what the Buddha is doing here, it's really kind of like a medical diagnosis. And there are some who argue that he modeled this after such a medical diagnosis. Remember the story of the arrow, somebody wounded by an arrow, and one of Buddha's students wants to know the details of what really happens in enlightenment. Can you conceptually analyze it for me? And the Buddha kind of famously says, well, it's like somebody shot you with an arrow, somebody shot with an arrow in battle, and you're asking about what is this arrow made of? Who shot the arrow? Who's the guy? What's the guy's age who shot the arrow? In other words, you're asking irrelevant questions when the point is just to heal the arrow wound. Okay, so I restate that story to just remind you, all of Buddhism, the point, it's like this medical diagnosis, except it's a spiritual diagnosis to heal our spiritual wound, to heal the wound of the dukkha, of the suffering that, again, as I always point out, it's not the perfect translation. I'll use it sometimes just because it's kind of useful in language, but really it's a lack of satisfaction. And I mean, the idea behind it is that this suffering or lack of satisfaction results really from us not accepting the world as it is, not accepting things as they are. And you'll see in the book this idea of craving. Right, that's the fundamental problem. Is there's this craving. We have it's okay to have desires. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you get attached to a desire and your entire being becomes bound up in wanting that thing, whether it's sex or a partner or a bigger house or a material thing of some kind or even just a degree, and when you become obsessed with it like that, that's a type of craving. And so Buddha's fundamental point is that we will never heal this deep dukkha within us. We will never be able to treat ourselves spiritually as one would treat somebody medically until we acknowledge that process of craving is really the ultimate problem. And so really it's, another metaphor is like the metaphor. I mean, I was going to say Jenga, but Jenga's not quite right. It's like if you have something, maybe like a foundation. If you have a foundation on a building and that foundation is bad and you build a bunch of stuff up on it, the whole structure is ultimately going to be bad and fall down someday. It's not going to work very well. But getting rid of that foundation and building something else in its place, or in the Buddhist case, would just be realizing there never was a foundation. That's the no self argument that I've mentioned and I'll talk about more later. But getting rid of that bottom cause that's really the result of everything else, that'll fix everything, right? It's because that's fundamentally the cause of all our suffering from the Buddhist point of view. So what is the cause of that dukkha? Well, the cause of that dukkha is this principle of anatman, or no self, which actually, yeah, let me say a few things about it now because it really connects. And it's just the idea that is the source of the dukkha. That's the source of the suffering, of the unpleasantness, and that's really where the craving comes from, because we believe there's actually a self that will be satisfied by the material possession, by the sex, by the drugs, by whatever it is. But if we realize there isn't a self, we're pulling out that foundation, we're pulling the rug out, so to speak, and therefore that craving and that dukkha never arises to begin with. And so that's the fundamental source. Now, there's a lot of kind of conceptual analysis that's necessary here to figure this out. Buddha did it both conceptually, but also mainly in terms of experience. But basically his point is that there's really, the self is really an unanalyzed concept, an unanalyzed experience. We just kind of assume it's always there. The same way that sometimes people, the children just assume their parents are telling them the truth about Santa Claus until they get old enough to ask, and their parents finally usually tell them, yeah, we just kind of tell you that because it makes it easier and you're really happy when you come downstairs. But it's a very rare child that at 3 or 4 years old is like, wait, is there really a Santa Claus? And they're looking at the chimney, to look for some red garment that he left behind. But basically, the idea of the self, the idea that we have this permanent self, the Buddha thinks it's like Santa Claus. That's the point of that analogy, in that sense. He thinks it's something that we have not examined, we take for granted. Everybody else says we have a self. Everybody else calls you by your name. We even have language that says, be yourself. In the course of all these lectures, I've used the term I. It's something we can't get away from. But really, when we analyze it, the Buddha says, we see that there's no grounding to it. And so just to remind you of that, in Hinduism, the idea is there's a self, but it's not what we think it is. In Hinduism, the self is the Brahman Atman. And you peel away the onion, but it's never fully peeled in the sense that there's a center in Hinduism, in Vedanta, the center is that Brahman Atman. The Buddha says, again, the name no Atman, anatman, says not even the Atman is real, which, as I said in the last video, was revolutionary for his time. And so I'm not going to get into it now, but the Buddha had an entire kind of meditative process where you look inward and you try to find the source of the self as though a child were investigating if Santa Claus really exists. And this is where you'll see in the chapter it gets into the 5 aggregates, which are sensations, perceptions, feelings, memories, volitions. And what the Buddha is ultimately going to point out is that we can notice, if you look in, for instance, let's just talk about our memories. Think of a memory, look inward and do a brief meditation and look in at some memory. Even something simple. What did you eat for breakfast yesterday? What did you do yesterday? That memory, the Buddha will point out, it'll come to your mind when you think of it, and then it'll just pass away. It doesn't have any really physical, solid existence. Sensations, emotions. We, think of a time when you got in a disagreement with somebody and you kind of felt anger or some sort of unpleasantness welling up in you. If you really pay attention to that, you'll see that it's just kind of contractions in your body and your heart area and things like that. And, 2 hours later, it's completely gone and you're, eating dinner, not thinking about it. Or if you are thinking about it, it's a vestige of the past. So again, I'm not going to go through all those, but the idea is that if you really try to investigate and find the self, there's no self. Just like if you investigate Santa, there's no Santa. It was just your parents telling you a story. So that's the idea. Okay, so one other way to think about this is that, and I love this metaphor. You'll notice that I have to use a lot of metaphors in talking about religious philosophy like this, spiritual philosophy, because so many of the experiences we've talked about are ineffable, or insofar as we can put them into words, we can only point at certain experiences. But the metaphor I'm thinking of is the metaphor of the whirlpool. And so another way to say it is that, and this goes along with the Buddhist concept also in the book of impermanence, there's no thing that is really fundamentally permanent. Everything is always impermanent and in flux. I gave the example in a previous video of somebody sitting down. Are they really just not moving? Are they somehow a permanent thing if you're just sitting there? No, your body is aging slowly. Your cells are gradually decaying. I'm not the same person I was 10 years ago, and neither are you. We look different. Our bodies have changed and fluctuated. No object in the world, including subatomic particles, they will eventually decay. The sun will eventually explode and so forth. We can see easy things like a leaf that crumbles after the season's over, after fall's over. But everything in the Buddhist perspective is impermanent. And really, we might appreciate that in the world around us, but we think of ourselves as permanent. And that's what the Buddha is undercutting here. He's pulling the rug out from underneath us and saying, hey, look, the whole world's not permanent. That includes us and our very concept of self. Okay, so a lot of that touches on the Four Noble Truths that I just went over, but let me just kind of specifically touch on a few of them here. So the first one, of course, is dukkha. It's the dukkha that the Buddha saw that he noticed that he didn't name yet when he first realized in his 20s that, hey, I have everything I want. I've all these indulgences, everything I want, but I'm still not happy fundamentally. There's still something beneath the surface that's bubbling up that's making me think there's something more to this life. This life isn't meaningful. That was the dukkha. It's an unpleasantness. So that's again why translating it as suffering per se is not the right translation, because even when it seems like you're not suffering, according to Buddhism and according to the Buddha, you really are still suffering. You're just not noticing it. It's beneath the surface. You're covering it up with other stuff. You're covering it up with playing a video game or reading a book. Again, nothing wrong with those activities in themselves, but if they're used as a way to cover up the truth of who you are, then they lead to suffering, and you're always stuck in that pattern of craving from the Buddhist perspective. I like to think of the dukkha as I don't know if you all have ever been in a room, often a classroom, where you're sitting, you're listening to the professor talk or lecture or the class discussion, and suddenly you notice that a sound disappears from what was in the background. And you realize that the air conditioner or the heater had been on and you hadn't noticed it. But then it disappears and it's kind of quieter and you're like, oh shit, that's nice. I didn't notice that. I like to use that analogy because to me that's what it's like. Like I said, I've meditated a lot. When the dukkha recedes and goes away, to me that's kind of what it's like. It's like there was this background thing that was kind of annoying you and like getting in your nerves, and you didn't really know what it was. But then when it goes away, it's like just peace. And so the idea of the dukkha is just that. It's always there in the background. Now, to be fair, this is why it's sometimes translated as suffering. Dukkha does include actual physical suffering, right? That it's just that it's a broader concept. So the dukkha is this lack of satisfaction that could be in terms of, oh shit, I broke my leg, it hurts. It could be my mom's got cancer, she's going to die, or whatever it is. And those things are all tragic. But the Buddha is saying something deeper and more metaphysically deep, in that he's pointing to that even when things are going all honky-dory and kittens and butterflies, on the surface, beneath the surface is this lack of satisfaction with life, right? And I think people who've experienced depression, now I don't have clinical depression, but like many of us, I've experienced mild depression here and there. It's that feeling that even when you're supposed to be happy, right? Even when you have the things you want, when you're depressed, it doesn't matter, right? People can even tell you, man, why are you depressed? You're attractive, or whatever it is that people say about you. You're really good at sports. You're strong. You have a good partner. You have friends. Like, what are you so sad about? None of that helps when you feel depressed, right? It doesn't matter. And so the Buddha is saying we all have that kind of level of depression in this example that's lurking beneath the surface. So that's dukkha. Another way to say it is like there's a deep sense of angst. It's a good word we use in English, right? A deep sense of angst, that there's always something missing. Okay, so the second noble truth I already kind of mentioned, it's craving. It goes back to that craving. And so the first noble truth is just realizing that suffering is the condition, that dukkha is the condition of existence. The second noble truth is the idea that, and again, this is where the translations mess up again. I know I'm always saying that, but it's true. Often the translations don't get translated right. Sometimes the second noble truth is translated as just selfishness. And so people think, oh, it's selfish people who are the ones who cause suffering. No, the second noble truth is that craving exists in all of us. We are all ego-driven in the sense that we are identified with a permanent self or a permanent ego. And again, anatman, the denial of a self, takes away that illusion, right? So the second noble truth is sometimes called trishna, or craving, and it's just to realize that it's not the idea that the self exists. Buddhist isn't denying that the self exists. It's just not what we think it is. It's just a process. It's just a thing of doing, right? It's just a process. It's a doing. And I realize now that I forgot to mention to go into more depth on the metaphor of the whirlpool. And actually, this is a perfect place to do it. So the metaphor of the whirlpool is the idea that things just, like when you look at a whirlpool, a whirlpool could be human created, or it could occur in nature through a storm or something like that. A whirlpool isn't a physical permanent thing, right? It's not a chair. It's an action, right? right? Really, a more accurate way to describe a whirlpool is a whirlpooling. It's always moving. It's literally part of the definition of what it is. And so for the Buddha, everything is like that, right? Everything has an action. A chair chairs, a human humans. And so another way to think about what the Buddha is saying here is that we tend to think of stuff as permanent, including our own self, as though it's this thing that will always be, but it's really more like a whirlpool. It's just a process or collection of things that happens to be together at one time. I'm just a process of cells and brain and heart and veins and so forth that happens to be in this one place and time. And much like the lotus flower will die, I will die one day too. And that's true for all of us from the Buddhist perspective. So the problem is this craving. And again, the Buddha isn't saying you shouldn't have desires. Remember, he explicitly said it's not the right path to go down the path of the ascetic monk, of the sadhu. It's not right to completely deny your desires. He said it's okay to indulge sometimes. But the problem is attaching to things, right? To wanting things to holding on to things when they're gone. Instead of having a beautiful night where you just enjoy it, the next day you say, I want to recreate that. I want to live that again. I'm going to try to create the exact conditions to relive that beautiful moment. That's exactly against what the Buddha is saying, right? The problem is attachment to things. It's not material things in themselves. It's perfectly compatible with Buddhism for a Buddhist practitioner to enjoy a nice piece of cake or even enjoy a good movie, as long as they don't get attached to it, which leads to craving and so forth. So anyways, that's the second noble truth. The third noble truth is that it can be extinguished, right? The flame of the ego can burn out. And this gets a little bit into reincarnation, which I talked a little bit about before. The idea of reincarnation is like a candle flame. Our ego, the process of our ego, the whirlpooling of our ego, the egoing of our ego goes from one rebirth to the next. And when somebody reaches enlightenment, it's extinguished. Nirvana, remember, means the blowing out of a flame, or it's often translated that way. It gets blown out and there's no reincarnation, and you realize your true nature and you sort of reintegrate with the world. Although that, again, even that word is wrong because it's not a reintegration. It's just a realization of what's true about you as being an impermanent being. And so the third noble truth is the extinguishment or the cessation of the process, right? Another way to say it is that sometimes the third noble truth is stated as there is a way out of this, right? The first noble truth is life is dukkha, lack of satisfaction. The second is this happens because of craving and the false idea that our ego is permanent. And then the third noble truth is like, there is a possibility of nirvana. You can pull the rug out from under and stop the entire process. And then the fourth noble truth is really goes into the Buddha's middle path that he realized in his own. Again, he said, indulgence isn't the right way, but self-denial is also not the right way, known as the middle path. And then that will be spelled out in more depth in terms of sometimes called the Eightfold Path, which, as the book points out, is actually in some ways similar to some of the Hindu Vedanta traditions from before. And again, don't forget that much like Jesus built his philosophy and his religion off of a previous religion of Judaism, the Buddha is building Buddhism off of the previous religion of Hinduism, or in particular Vedanta. And so that's why there will be a lot of crossover in both cases. Okay, I'll stop it there.